Namaste. We've talked about myth and its usefulness, and when perhaps it's not so useful. And so yesterday, the grandkids were over, and they like to watch Adam 12. It's my fault. I introduced them to Adam 12. And you would think that would be, at least to my memory, the most benign police show you could have anybody watch. And they're 6 and they're 4. So sure enough, they're watching the streaming episode, the episode after episode on Hulu in the morning, and there comes this episode that I had never seen about a police officer being killed. And they showed the funeral, which was pretty much modeled after the pictures I've seen of JFK's funeral, right down to one of the officer's children being given the folded up flag, and they're pulling the funeral out of the hearse, and it's, what's that big box? And oh, Jesus. And so, I explained what the box was. Then the two of them were sort of conversing about what happens when you're dead. And I went straight for the mythological, concrete interpretation, which was, you go to live with God. Because a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old are not going to do the abstract. And then why is your body in the ground? I mean, some of these questions were amazingly complex, even though asked in a really simplistic level.
Pretty valid, I imagine.
Oh yeah, I mean, real concerns. And one of them said, well, if they put your body in the ground, then, how can you go to live with God because you don't have a body? And then the other one said something else along those lines. And I was just trying to come up with the answer that would require the least amount of money be spent in therapy later in life. That was truly my goal. How can I be as benign as possible? But it has bearing on this whole Thomas thing. Because this whole Thomas thing is mythologically framed, and we could deal with some of the mythology, but sometimes to deal with the mythology is to miss the point. And one of the things that's really interesting about the story, as I've often heard it, is this huge emphasis on Thomas having said, I won't believe, or more traditionally, I will not believe. And how terrible is that? What a problem that was. Can you imagine? How could someone not believe? And I thought an interesting juxtaposition to that was this Philip Moffat article. And even Philip Moffat is an interesting juxtaposition because he was the editor of Esquire magazine, which is sort of the male equivalent of Cosmopolitan, but not quite. And I had a pretty successful career in the publishing industry and decided that it didn't mean anything to him and walked away from it. And he's an insight meditation teacher now in the Vipassana tradition. But I think he does a real good job distinguishing between types of doubts. And I think the first one, I came up with my own names for these 3 kinds of doubts. The first one is the easy bake oven doubt. It's the doubt that leads little boys to take apart their sister's easy bake oven. It wants to know, how in the world does that work? And if I can just get inside it, I can figure out how it works, and then it'll be good. Or can you show me how it works? And it is good doubt, normal doubt, healthy doubt. And I think it's the doubt of, unless I can put my hand in his side, put my finger in the wounds, I will not believe. Thomas is really just saying, how does this work? The second one, instead of saying, how does this work, says, it can't work that way or it doesn't work that way. It's the doubt of preconceived notion. It's the doubt that says, I have closed my mind, this is how the world operates. And that's all there is to it. Which is great. You might even say to a certain extent, it's the doubt of science. Because, Kimberly and I were talking about this Thursday a little bit, until very recently, the Big Bang was how it worked. And now quantum physicists are starting to look at the Big Bang and saying, wait a minute. Maybe it's that there was no beginning to the universe, and there's no end to the universe, and it's always existed. And the reason they think that might be the case, and physics is way beyond me, but it's essentially that if you take Einstein's theory of relativity, which is what the Big Bang comes from, when you get back to Big Bang time, all of the rules of the theory of relativity fall apart. The laws don't work anymore. And so there is sort of this leap of faith, and there's nothing wrong with leaps of faith, but the quantum physicists have taken their quantum equations, which I have to take their word for it, right? And said, no, if we use these equations in here, then we don't have to suspend the rules of anything. It does all make sense. And it says that basically the universe, while it's ever expanding, has also always been here. And the other side of the Big Bang was that at some point, everything was going to be sucked into darkness and end. And these quantum theories say, no, that's not the case. So that second doubt of it doesn't work that way usually arises when we're pretty darn sure we figured out how it works. And by golly, we're not going to listen to anything that says it might be any different. I could change the oil in my car by myself when I was a kid, and that means I can do it today, no matter how much cars have changed in the intervening time. So if the first doubt is the good doubt, the second doubt is the bad doubt. And if you like spaghetti westerns, you know what's coming next is the ugly doubt.
Yeah.
Or maybe the untrue doubt. And that's the doubt that says, I can't. So the first doubt says, how does it work? Show me. The second doubt says, it can't work that way, it doesn't work that way. And the third doubt says, I can't. It's beyond me. I'll never be able to do that. It's just not possible for me. Now, sometimes that's reasonable, and then it really isn't doubt. I'm never going to run a 5-minute mile. Never could, never will, and I'm okay with that. That's realistic, a realistic understanding of my limitations. But if you're a musician and you say, I'll never learn how to play this piece of music, that's not realistic. You don't know. It's an excuse to withdraw from the race. I can't says, no, I can't. And what it does is, it takes our potential and denies it. And says, this is it, end of story. It's never going to get any better. It's also the doubt that says, it's never going to stop raining. When I moved to Boston in 1985, and it rained for the first 15 days I was there, and it was March, so it rained and iced.
Oh.
And I said to myself, what have I done? This is never going to end. And there were permanent puddles, in the driveways and the yards and just everywhere. That's this third kind of doubt. And I said, oh my God, what was I thinking? Nobody told me this. This is not Paul Revere's Great Ride. This is a swamp. So looking then at those three kinds of doubt, the first one is always helpful. The first one says, how does it work? What's the story? What's underneath this? And it's also the one that won't get you swindled. It's the one that when they call up and say, there's 6 people on your computer that you don't know about, it says, wait a minute, you're going to have to prove this to me. And so to say that doubt is either always good or always bad, we can see that that's a mistake when you start dividing it up into these 3 kinds of doubt. When you have the good, the bad, the ugly, or the untrue, doubt can be a positive force. In fact, in one of his most famous sutras, the Buddha said, don't believe what I tell you because I told you. Believe it because you've checked it out for yourself and it works for you. Which is a huge difference from how this passage from John ends. But before we get there, this whole peace be with you thing. This particular translation doesn't show it up very well. More traditional translations say, if you forgive anyone's sins, they are forgiven. If you don't forgive them, they are retained, rather than they aren't forgiven. And some years ago, it occurred to me to ask the question, who retains them? I often tell the story of my mother who separated from my father in 1978. And in probably 2002, for the upteenth time, she asked me, she said, I don't know how your father looks at himself in the mirror in the morning and shaves after what he did to me. And I did the math and determined that about 25 years had passed. And I finally said, probably just fine, because it's been a long time, and I'm quite sure he doesn't even think about it. Which was not, can I just say, not the desired response. You know, if there had been a buzzer, it would have rung. If it was a gong show, you know, bong. But it's true. And when we don't forgive, we imagine that we're punishing the person we're not forgiving. That somehow, you know, we've got the evil mark is on them, and unless we agree to erase it, they're going to carry it around with them no matter what. And the truth is, we carry it around. And I've always thought that, you know, you can pick and choose translations for every Sunday till it illustrates your point, but I'd rather just point it out this way and say, you know, I don't think that what was actually happening is that Jesus was saying certain human beings have the ability to forgive sins in the name of God and others don't. I think what he was actually saying is forgiveness frees us all. Which then means when we get down to Thomas, it's hardly likely that Jesus had a chip on his shoulder about whether Thomas really believed or not. And so when Jesus said, if Jesus said, do you believe because you see me? Happy are those who don't see and yet believe. What we've been told is that, see, and it's usually right preachers who say this, see, you need to believe what I tell you because Jesus says so right here. It's wrong to ask for proof because Jesus says so right here. But Jesus didn't say so right there. He just maybe was realistic enough to acknowledge that there were probably going to be more people who couldn't poke their hand in his side or their finger in the wounds than could. And that there would have to be another process that you would go through then to arrive at some degree of certainty. And maybe it's that first kind of doubt. Coupled with maybe that, avoiding that third kind of doubt. That first kind of doubt that says, I want to figure out how this works, I need to investigate it. And the self-confidence that says, I can figure it out. I can come to a reasonable conclusion, and I can hold that conclusion loosely so that I avoid that second problem by saying that this is what I think, this is what the evidence leads me to believe, this is what my experience leads me to believe, and I feel pretty comfortable with that. But if something should happen that would change what I believe or present evidence to the contrary or that a different opinion was better, I'm going to be flexible enough to be able to shift. And I want to say that's where peace really starts to come from. That holding loosely. Because if we hold everything tight and we say, this is what it is, and it's understandable, we're so happy, we finally figured it all out. And so you want to grab onto that and say, by God, I finally have the answer. Here it is. Look, isn't this great? And then something comes up and we're holding on too tight. Now we're either going to get into arguments about it, or we're going to start doing these bizarre kind of contortions in thought and belief to make sure that it still lines up just right. There's a joke, and I forget which tradition it comes from. One of the ethnic traditions about a guy who hears that there's a tailor in town who's the best tailor there is. So he goes to have a suit made. And tailor takes the measurements and gets the suit all made, and the guy goes to try it on, and it turns out, you know, that one arm is a little too long and it's not quite right in the shoulder. And he says to the tailor, look, this isn't right, this is too long. And the tailor says, well, that's because you have to kind of go like this, and then it'll be just right. Then the arms will be just perfect. He says, but what about, you know, this hump in the back? And the tailor says, well, that's supposed to be there. You just need to lean forward a little bit. And so the guy walks out of the tailor shop kind of like this, and he runs into a guy who says, that you had that tailor around the corner make that suit, didn't you? And the guy says, well, how did you know? And he says, well, somebody crippled as you. That tailor's the only guy that could possibly make you a suit. But that's what we do when we hold on tightly to this has to be okay, right? We end up walking down the street like this, trying to make it so. And there are worse things in the world than saying, you know, I've changed my mind. And one of them is kind of this. But haven't we all run into that person? I mean, hopefully not with a suit.
Who are you thinking up there?
Your Mormon friend.
Oh, yes.
They got the answer to everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, tell him I found him a tailor.
Each of my friends fits one of your descriptions.
And it's,
Lisa is the super skeptical, and I was just talking with Teresa yesterday, and she cannot make up her mind whether she wants to do this business or not. But she doesn't have enough gumption to tell me she doesn't want to do it. Like, come on, just decide.
Quit doubting. You can do it.
Well, we talked about, not having enough confidence in yourself.
right,
Yeah.
right. Which is ultimately a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
So the real place, the healthy place, the peaceful place, can be at times uncomfortable, but it's the place where we just hold things loosely and are willing to ask important questions, allowing that the answers will change. And if somebody tells us the problem is that you just need to stand like this, maybe say no once in a while. Amen.